I was 22 minutes from home when the woman on the radio started describing my dead husband. Not vaguely. Not in the general way that grief stories resemble each other, because grief has a universal shape. She was describing specific things. The way he folded a newspaper. The particular phrase he used when he was thinking carefully about something. The smell of the cologne he wore every day for 30 years. I drove past my exit. I drove another quarter-mile before I understood that my hands had stopped responding to my instructions and that I needed to pull over before I stopped responding entirely. I sat on the shoulder of the highway with the engine running and the radio on and listened to a woman I had never heard describe a man I had been married to for 38 years. She said he had died a year ago. She said she missed him every single day. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I am 62 years old and I live in Connecticut. Thomas was my husband for 38 years. He died 19 months ago on a Tuesday morning in February. In the time since, I have learned things about the life I was living that I never expected to know. I did not expect to learn this on a Tuesday afternoon on the highway, from a radio program I had never listened to before and have not listened to since. If this story stays with you, please subscribe and leave me a comment below. Tell me what city you are watching from. I read every single one. Now let me tell you about the voice on the radio. I had been driving back from my attorney's office. Patricia's office had become familiar in the way places become familiar when you spend enough difficult hours in them. The parking structure on the left. The coffee shop on the ground floor. The elevator with the slow doors that required patience. 19 months of discoveries had made that route as known to me as my own street. That Tuesday had been routine by the standards of the past year and a half, final signatures on documents related to the civil recovery, a brief update from Patricia on the remaining legal threads, the kind of afternoon that felt like the administration of something rather than the living of something. I had left her office at 3:15 and pointed the car toward home. I rarely listened to the radio. Thomas had been the radio person in our marriage. He liked the local public station, the afternoon drive programming, the interview shows that ran between 4 and 6. After he died, I found the silence of the car easier than the reminder of his preferences. I had driven in quiet for most of 19 months. That afternoon, I turned the radio on without thinking about it. A reflex, a muscle memory from years of being the passenger while Thomas drove, reaching for the dial without deciding to. The station it landed on was his station. The afternoon program. A woman was speaking. She was being interviewed about grief. The host, a man with the patient, unhurried quality of someone who does this for a living, was asking her about losing her father. She had called in to respond to a previous segment, she said, about whether children ever truly know their parents. She had thoughts about that. She had specific thoughts. I was not paying close attention at first. The familiar highway, the familiar route, the familiar low-level exhaustion of a woman who has been managing a complex legal and personal situation for 19 months. My mind was partly elsewhere. Then she said something that brought my full attention to the radio as suddenly and completely as a hand on my shoulder in a quiet room. She said her father used to fold his newspaper into quarters before he read it. Not in half. Into quarters, a precise fold, crisp, the same way every morning. She said she had never seen anyone else do it that way. She said it was the kind of detail that grief preserves while larger things blur. I looked at my hands on the steering wheel. Thomas folded his newspaper into quarters. I had never once, in 38 years, seen anyone else do it that way. I turned up the volume. The host asked her to describe her father. She said he was a careful man. That careful was the word she always returned to when she tried to describe him. Not cold, careful. There was a difference, she said. Cold means you don't feel things. Careful means you have decided to manage them. I had described Thomas that way myself. Careful. Exactly that word. She said he was a family law attorney. The highway in front of me continued. Traffic moved. A truck passed on my left. The ordinary machinery of a Tuesday afternoon. I kept driving and I kept listening. She said he had retired in his mid-60s. That the retirement had changed him in ways she hadn't expected. He had become quieter. He took long drives alone. He seemed to be working through something he didn't discuss with anyone. She said he wore the same cologne for as long as she could remember. A specific scent, she described it. Bergamot and cedar and something slightly warm underneath. She said when she smelled it now on a stranger, she had to stop walking for a moment. The cologne Thomas wore for 30 years. The exact description. The same 3 notes. I drove past my exit. I did not notice until I had gone another quarter mile. The host asked how her father had died. She said cardiac arrest. That it had been sudden. That she had not had a chance to say anything to him before he was gone. That the absence of a final conversation was the thing she returned to most often in the year since. February, she said. He died in February of last year. I pulled onto the shoulder. I sat with the engine running and my hands in my lap and listened. The host asked if she had been close to her father. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, close was complicated. That she had loved him completely, and that loving him had sometimes meant accepting things she didn't understand. He had not been present for much of her childhood. He had come back into her life when she was an adult and had been, in those years, attentive and warm and interested in who she had become. But there were parts of his life he never discussed. A whole geography he kept to himself. She said she had accepted this for years. She said grief had made her less accepting. That after he died she had started wanting the parts he had kept hidden. The host asked if she had found anything. She said she was still looking. The host thanked her. Started to move to the next caller. I picked up my phone. I had the radio station's website open before I had fully decided to open it. The number was on the contact page. I called it. A young woman answered with the cheerful efficiency of someone managing a busy afternoon call queue. I said I had been listening to the program. I said the woman who had just been on, the one talking about her father, I needed to speak with her. I understood if that wasn't possible. I understood if she had called from a private number and didn't want to be contacted. But I needed her to know that I had been listening and that what she had described, the newspaper, the cologne, the law career, February, those were not coincidences. The young woman was quiet for a moment. Then she put me on hold. I sat on the shoulder of the highway for 11 minutes. Traffic passed. The radio continued playing, a different segment now, something about local zoning that I did not hear. Then a different voice came on the line. Not the young woman from the call queue. A quieter voice. More careful. The voice of someone who had just been told something and was proceeding with appropriate caution. She said her name was Nora. She said she was the woman who had called in. She said the producer had told her what I said and she had stayed. She had almost left, but she had stayed. She asked me to say his name. I said Thomas Allen Brooks. The silence that followed lasted long enough that I looked at my phone to check that the call had not dropped. It had not dropped. She said, that was not the name he used with us. I closed my eyes. Us. Not me. Us. She said there was a mother. And a brother. And that they had believed for 30 years that their father's name was Robert Callister and that he had died in February of last year of cardiac arrest while visiting family in another state. She said she was in her early 30s and had been raised primarily by her mother, but that her father had been present, in the particular intermittent way of a man with obligations he was managing elsewhere, for as long as she could remember. She said her brother was younger. 28. 2 children. Thomas had 2 more children. I sat on the shoulder of the highway and did the arithmetic of a life I had believed I understood completely. Lucas, my son, 36 years old. Sophie, Thomas's daughter from his first secret marriage, 34, living in Portland. And now Nora, early 30s. And a brother, 28. 4 children. Thomas had 4 children. Only one of them had ever known his real name. I looked at the highway in front of me and understood that what I had believed was the bottom of Thomas's hidden life had a lower floor. I asked Nora if she was somewhere she could talk. She said she was still at the radio station. That the producer had offered her a conference room. That she was sitting in it now with the door closed. I told her I was going to tell her several things that were going to be difficult to hear. I told her I had learned, over the past 19 months, that difficult information was better received quickly and completely than slowly and in managed portions. I asked if she wanted that. She said yes. So I told her. I told her about the storage unit and the false passport. I told her about the 4 other women, Catherine, Ruth, Diane, Margaret, and their document boxes. I told her about Lindsay and the supplements and the trial. I told her about Sophie in Portland and the wedding album in the box from the back of the study closet. I told her that Thomas Allen Brooks had been one of his names. That he had also been Daniel Mercer, David, Michael, and apparently Robert Callister. 5 names. 5 names across one life. Nora was quiet through most of it. She asked 3 questions. The first was whether I was certain it was the same man. I told her about the cologne, the newspaper, the law career, the cardiac arrest in February. I told her that certainty was the wrong word for anything Thomas related, but that the convergence of detail made coincidence implausible. The second question was about her mother. She asked what had happened to the women. Whether they had known about each other. Whether they had been, she searched for the word, protected. In some way. I told her about the account in my name. The one Thomas had established years ago, designated for me, that had been recovered as part of the civil process. I told her that Thomas had, in his own distorted way, attempted to leave provisions for the people he was leaving behind. That this did not excuse what he had done, but that it was part of the full picture. She was quiet again. Then she asked the third question. She asked if I was angry. I thought about that honestly. I told her I had been angry for a long time. That anger had been useful in the early stages. It had given me forward momentum when grief alone would have kept me still. That at some point the anger had become something more like determination, and the determination had become something more like clarity, and the clarity had settled, eventually, into something I was still working on naming. I told her that hearing her voice on the radio had not made me angry. It had made me tired. And then, underneath the tired, something that felt closer to grief for her than for anything else. She said she appreciated me saying that. Then she said, her brother's name was James. I remembered the account Thomas had established in my name. James Eleanor Brooks. A first name buried inside a false identity. Not random. A son's name. Hidden in plain sight inside the account he had established for me. I sat on the shoulder of the highway for a long moment. He had put his son's name in the account he built for his wife. 2 people he could not acknowledge at the same time. One name, fused together. I told Nora I needed to call my attorney. I told her I wanted to meet her in person. I told her that she and her brother deserved to know everything and that I was in a position to tell them everything, and that Patricia would need to be involved because there were legal dimensions to this that required proper handling. She said she needed time. A few days. She needed to talk to her mother. She needed to talk to James. I told her I would wait. I had waited 19 months. A few more days was not a difficulty. We exchanged numbers. She thanked me for calling the station. I told her I was glad she had stayed. When the call ended, I sat on the shoulder for a while longer. Then I called Patricia. She answered on the first ring. Nora called back in 3 days. She had spoken to her mother, whose name was Frances, who had been with Thomas, with Robert, in her version of the story, for 14 years before his death. Frances had known, for the final 2 years of the relationship, that Robert was not entirely who he had presented himself as. She had found inconsistencies she could not explain and had chosen not to pursue them because the alternative, the full understanding of what those inconsistencies meant, was something she had not been ready for. Nora said her mother had not been surprised when Nora told her what I had told her. She had not been surprised, and she had cried for an hour, and then she had made dinner and eaten it. I recognized that sequence entirely. James had been harder. Nora said her brother had been closer to their father than she had. That the intermittent presence that Nora had learned to navigate with a certain detachment had been, for James, simply the shape of how fathers were. He had not known to expect more and had not known he was missing something. The revelation that the man he had called Robert for 28 years was also Thomas, also Daniel, also several other names in several other cities, that had required more than a few days. It had required 3 weeks. When James was ready, Patricia arranged the meeting. We met at a neutral location, a conference room at a hotel in New Haven, which was equidistant between my house in Connecticut and where Nora and James had grown up in Rhode Island. Patricia was present. Sandra was available by phone. I had asked Lucas if he wanted to be there, and he had said yes without hesitating because that was who Lucas had become. Nora was smaller in person than I had imagined from her voice. Dark hair. Her father's careful posture, I recognized it immediately and said nothing. James was taller. He had Thomas's eyes in a way that required me to look at the table for a moment before I could look at him directly. We spent 4 hours in that conference room. I told them everything again, with Patricia present to handle the legal dimensions. Patricia explained what the civil recovery had produced. She explained that Thomas's estate, which had been substantially recovered over the past 19 months, had provisions that could extend to biological children if certain conditions were established. She explained this carefully. She did not promise anything. She presented the legal reality as it was and allowed Nora and James to understand it fully before responding. Nora asked about Sophie. I had expected this question and had called Sophie the previous week to prepare her for it. Sophie had been quiet on the phone for a long time. Then she had said, "How many of us are there?" I had told her about Nora and James. She had said she would need a few days and then she would like to be in contact. I gave Nora Sophie's email address, with Sophie's knowledge. James did not speak for most of the meeting. He sat with his hands flat on the conference table and listened, and when he did speak it was to ask precise factual questions that he absorbed and did not follow up on. The way you absorb facts when you need to understand the structure of something before you can have any feelings about it. At the end of the meeting, he looked at me directly for the first time. He said, "I have your name." I looked at him. He said, "The account. James Eleanor Brooks. He named me after you. He put my name next to yours." The conference room was very quiet. Lucas was watching me from across the table. I thought about what it meant that Thomas had put his son's name inside the account he had built for his wife. Whether it was guilt. Whether it was the closest he could come, in the architecture of his hidden life, to acknowledging two people he loved simultaneously and in secret. I said, I think he was trying to hold two things in the same place. He wasn't capable of doing that honestly. So he did it the only way he could. James looked at the table. Then he looked up. He said, "I spent 28 years thinking I was the reason he didn't stay. That I wasn't enough reason. I thought it was me." I said, "It was never you. It was never any of us. He had a problem that existed before any of us, and none of us were the cause of it, and none of us could have been the solution." He nodded slowly. That was not a small thing to have said. I know because I've needed to say it to myself many times over 19 months. After the meeting, Lucas drove home. Nora and James drove north. Patricia and I walked to the hotel coffee shop and sat for a few minutes without talking about anything in particular, which was a thing we had earned the right to do. I asked her if she thought there were more. More names. More families. More people who had heard Bergamot and Cedar on a stranger and had to stop walking for a moment. Patricia considered. She said she didn't know. She said the investigators had been thorough. She said that thorough and complete were not always the same thing. I told her I had stopped requiring them to be. It is March. 19 months since Thomas died on a Tuesday morning in February. For weeks since a Tuesday afternoon on the highway when a woman on the radio described the way he folded his newspaper. The garden is beginning. Not fully. Tentatively, the way March gardens begin in Connecticut, with small gestures and no commitments. A few crocuses near the front fence. The forsythia showing yellow at the tips before the leaves come. Nora emailed last week. She and Sophie had spoken on the phone for an hour. She said it was strange and necessary, and that she didn't know yet what it would become, but that the strangeness did not feel bad. James has not reached out. I did not expect him to, not yet. 28 years of believing something about your father requires more than a conference room in a New Haven hotel to dismantle. He has Patricia's contact information. He has mine. When he is ready, the door will be open. Lucas came for dinner on Sunday with the grandchildren. They wanted to look at the crocuses. They crouched at the front fence with the serious attention of children examining something small and important, and I stood behind them and thought about Thomas folding his newspaper into quarters at the kitchen table every morning for 38 years. The real things do not become unreal. That is the thing I keep returning to. I have spent 19 months discovering layers of deception so elaborate and sustained that they should, by any reasonable accounting, have retroactively unmade everything that came before them. Every shared morning, every dinner, every 38 years of a life built alongside another person. They haven't. The newspaper folded into quarters was real. The cracked bedroom window in January was real. The dancing with my mother twice at our wedding because her husband's knees were bad, that was real. The harm was also real. Both exist. Both are true. I have stopped requiring them to cancel each other out. If you are watching this and there is someone in your life whose complexity you are struggling to hold, someone who is genuinely good to you and genuinely harmful in the same years, in the same relationship, I want to say this directly. You are not required to resolve them into a simple version. The complicated truth is the actual truth. You can love what was real and grieve what was false and be angry about what was done and still remember the newspaper folded into quarters. All of it. At the same time. That is not weakness. That is the full range of what a human life contains. I am 62 years old. A woman I had never met called a radio station and changed what I thought I understood about the bottom of my husband's hidden life. I drove home. I made dinner. I went to bed. The crocuses are coming up at the front fence. That is enough for today. Leave me a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Tell me if you have ever heard something by accident that changed everything. Tell me what you did next. I read every single one.